So welcome everyone to the RMIT Distinction Lecture. I'm Xinhu Yu, the chair of RMIT Professorial Academy. I'm the host of this event. Firstly, I would like to acknowledge the people of the Kulin Nation on whose unceded lands we are meeting today. I respectively acknowledge their elders past and present. So today we shall hear from distinguished Professor Billie Giles-Corti about urban design, transport, and health. And some of the serious questions will be asked is such as, are we creating health and a sustainable city worldwide? So this lecture is part of the activity hosted by the Professorial Academy in fulfilling its obligations and as ambassador, advocate, and thought leader for RMIT. So before we start, so let's just go through some housekeeping matters. So this is a team live event, so you will not be able to directly ask any questions via microphone. However, just please post your questions in the Q&A sections during the lecture. And at the end of the lecture, I will pick up the popular ones and ask the presenter on your behalf. Okay, so let's start the lecture by introducing the speaker. Distinguished Professor Billie Giles-Corti is a Vice Chancellor Professor Fellow. For over 2 decades, she has been studying the impact of built environment on health and well-being. She currently leads the Healthy Livable Cities Lab at RMIT and is the Chief Investigator of the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre. So she has published over 400 articles, book chapters, and reports, and by citation is ranked top 1% of research in her field globally. So without further ado, please join me to welcome Billie to deliver her lecture. So over to you, Billie.
Thank you so much, Xing, and it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you everyone for joining. It's great to have people to listen to the work that we've been doing. Before I commence my talk, I would like to also acknowledge the people of the Wurrung and the Burrung language groups of the Eastern Kulin Nation and the traditional owners and custodians on the lands of which you are all sitting today as we present throughout the university. As our group, we recognise that their ongoing unceded sovereignty to the lands and waters on which we conduct our work, and we also acknowledge the wisdom of their ancestors and elders in caring for and protecting country over millennia. It's something that we hold dear because that's exactly what we're trying to do with our research, is to create research that will protect our country. So I'm going to be presenting today on work that we've been doing globally. There's a real urgency to transition to healthy and sustainable cities. We know that cities, of course, are the powerhouse of the economy, and they provide opportunities to employment, to education, all the things that we need for living and to help people prosper. But by 2050, the world's population is estimated will be 70% of the world's population will live in cities. And when they're poorly planned, as we see here on the right, they foster unhealthy and unsustainable lifestyles. They expose residents to a whole range of environmental stressors, air pollution, noise, and they also cause biodiversity loss. We've seen more biodiversity loss in recent decades than we've ever seen, putting at threat the ecosystem, and they widen inequities. Now, cities already generate 75% of global energy-related emissions, and it's important to note that 86% of global CO2 emissions are from the higher income countries, and yet the people who are most at threat with climate change, who have got less infrastructure and an economy to cope with it, are the lower income and middle income countries. So we have a big responsibility in high income countries. Now, we've seen in the recent years a number of reports that come out. Of course, the UN Sustainable Development Goals put fairly and squarely, goal 11 is around cities, and also there's another goal to do with climate change. We're seeing the World Health Organization put out its Shanghai Declaration on how we should be promoting health in the face of the UN's Sustainable Development Agenda, and it has a big focus to say that a healthy city should be our focus, that should be the mark of a healthy and sustainable city. The World Health Organization has also put out its roadmap for reducing non-communicable diseases as a sustainable development priority, tying to Goal 3 in the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And in 2018, the WHO also released its report, its global strategy for more people to be more active for a healthier world. If there's one thing that people can do for their health, is to be physically active. I can't tell you how important that is. And more recently, in 2020, the World Health Organization released another report that said that what we need to be doing is not having health separate to environment and climate change. We needed to bring this agenda together, and that we needed a transformation that would not only create healthy communities, but also create sustainable communities into the future. And of course, alarmingly, we've seen the IPC report that came out recently in 2021, and the recent report that came out this year on how we should mitigate climate change, which includes a big focus on the role of cities and the sorts of work that we're talking about here. Now, in 2016, I worked with a global group led by Mark Stevenson at University of Melbourne and co-led by myself and Jim Sellis, there in the middle in the yellow t-shirt, where we did a Lancet series on urban design, transport and health. Now, it was an important piece of work because it tried to take a systems approach to the way we think about the way we need to design cities. What we said is, if we're concerned about the downstream impacts of the way cities are built, their impact on road trauma, respiratory diseases, chronic diseases, all the things that cities can contribute. It's no point focusing downstream if we want to change cities to be healthier. We needed to be thinking about the upstream determinants of what causes the causes. So, for example, we proposed that we needed to have a focus on 8 urban systems that needed work in unison to create 8 urban and transport planning and design interventions. We call them the 8 Ds. 3 of them were regional planning interventions, destination accessibility, distribution to employment, demand management, trying to control where and what conditions cars can drive, but also local urban design, the design of the street networks, the density of the housing, distance to transit, the diversity of housing, the diversity of shops that are nearby, and desirability. This came out to be a very important issue in many of the lower and middle income countries, particularly around crime, but also around greenery. How attractive is it to walk? And these are important because they affect transportation choices, which is the focus of the first series. What we argued, though, is that what will get measured will get done, and what we needed to create a set of policy indicators. Do we have the policies in place to create these cities that will promote health? And what's the spatial some spatial indicators which would actually measure what's actually on the ground. And I'm going to walk you through that would be, how connected the street networks were, whether how far people lived to transport, how walkable the neighbourhoods were. These were the sorts of things we thought needed to be measured, and this is what we recommended. Now, we in our own group, the Healthy Livable Cities Lab at RMIT, has started to work on this sort of work, and we wanted to do a proof of concepts. We asked ourselves the questions: do we have the policies and frameworks in place in Australia to deliver healthy and sustainable communities, and what was the impact of these policies on the ground? And so we started mapping the livability of Australian cities. We looked at a number of different areas of underlying determinants or domains of livability: access to public open space, access to public transport, walkability, housing affordability, access to local employment, the food environment, the alcohol environment. So we measured these things, and then we published a report, Creating Livable Cities report, in which we actually measured and mapped and could show the walkability of our cities, people's access to public transport, and we related that back to the policies. And we concluded that we don't have the policies in place in Australia to deliver healthy and sustainable communities, and even if we did, the policies were not strong enough, and we were delivering suboptimal outcomes for Australians. It's fine if you live in the inner city, as we see here in Melbourne, but if you live in the outer suburban areas, people have very poor access to amenity. As you can see here by that walkability map, you can see in the middle, nice and green, very good, but out on the fringe, anything that's yellow through to red, people would need to drive. Now, we wanted to not just have that data sitting on our computer, we wanted to make it available for policymakers and practitioners to use. And we established the Australian Urban Observatory, which is led now by Melanie Davin in the Centre for Urban Research, and that provides data, all these maps, back to our policymakers and practitioners for their use. And we also, with work led by Lucy Gunn, created a series of court scorecards. And we did this for Australia's 21 largest cities. So we upscaled what we had done for our report, but we upscaled that and went to 21 larger cities. And these 21 larger cities were in the National Cities Performance Framework by the federal government. So it tied very much to policy. We've done all of our work to tie as much as possible to policy. All of our indicators have looked at policy, and so they speak to policymakers. That's the whole purpose of our work. But we wanted to go global because we'd had the Lancet series in 2016. And so in 2018, I attended the International Society for Physical Activity and Health Congress in London. And I got in touch with a number of the previous authors of the first series who were going to that conference, and we set up a meeting we set up a couple of sessions where we wanted to invite people to come on board and to work on a global study. It happened to be in 2018 that the World Health Organization was at the conference, and they launched their global strategy on increasing physical activity, more people, more active for a healthier world. And it had a big focus on the environment. So it was really well aligned in terms of global policy, something that the World Health Organization was pushing, and very much tied to the Sustainable Development Goals. But at that meeting, we invited people to join a collaboration. We said that we wanted to identify and measure health-related policy and spatial indicators, the sorts of things that I mentioned that we had proposed in our first series, and we wanted to do this worldwide. And we wanted to set ourselves up to publish a second series. Now, we had no guarantees from the Lancet that they would do this, but we had spoken to them, and they said, well, we'll consider it if you do the work. And then we went to a number of meetings. First of all, there was the International Physical Activity and Environment Network meeting at that conference. It has only over 60 countries involved in the network. And we also sought other collaborators. And as a result of that, we told people what was going to be involved. This was work led by, one of the strategies led by Melanie Lowe, who's now at the University of Melbourne. She was with our group initially, and then she's gone to Melbourne Uni. But she was responsible for the policy review, and we told people that what they would need to do is to look at the existence and the quality of policies in each of these areas, or the areas that are listed there. These are aligned with what we'd said in the first series of the Lancet. And then we wanted to create and map city level indicators. So we wanted to do the measurement and map them across so we could actually see what was going on in cities. And this was work that was led by people in my team, Jonathan Arundel and Carl Higgs. And we told people that what they'd need to do is, via a survey, assess the data that was available. And we sort of gave them clues about what was going to be involved. And the starting point was for anyone who signed up had to complete these online surveys that would help us give us the information that could tell us how well we could try and measure these things globally. So our goal was to facilitate the development of this global system of policy and spatial indicators for healthy and sustainable cities. We established an executive. So we had an executive, as you can see here, they're all from all over the world. And we used to meet once a month. And together, this group oversaw the development of the project. We ended up with 80 collaborators in 25 cities, 19 countries and 6 continents. And here are the cities detailed here. Now that group, the studied executive, have met every month since 2018. We've been meeting and working together. It's been an amazing collaboration, and through them we have worked through the policy team and through the spatial team, have been working with our 80 collaborators across the world. So we wanted to, first of all, I suppose, in terms of the second series that we're aiming to do for the Lancet, was to look at, is it feasible to measure policies in cities worldwide? And if it was, do cities have policies in place to deliver healthy and sustainable cities? Because we didn't know whether they did. We found in Australia that they don't. So it's quite feasible that they're not going to do that globally either. We looked at, are there thresholds? So if we're going to create cities that are healthy and sustainable, do they have thresholds in their standards for urban design and policy features that would achieve active and sustainable lifestyles. And this was very much tied to the World Health Organization's launch of their new global strategy. We wanted to measure whether or not the policies that are in place across the world are going to achieve these active lifestyles, which the World Health Organization was saying was so important. We then wanted to ask the question, is it feasible to consistently measure spatial indicators of urban design and transport features worldwide, and are there inequities in the distribution of these features in cities? We really want to say, well, are we creating health supportive features in cities or not, and who's got access to them? Who are the winners and who are the losers? And then we wanted to ask, well, what next? So we wanted to open the way for a third series by asking the question, what next to create healthy and sustainable cities? Now, what I'm going to do is talk you through the results of our research that went on for 3.5 years, basically. So first of all, the first paper was led by Melanie Lowe. She was a former PhD student of mine, and then became a research fellow and has led this work globally, which is a fantastic piece of work. And in this question, we're asking the questions, do we have the policies in place to deliver healthy and sustainable cities? Now, as I mentioned, if we want to create healthy cities downstream, we needed to measure the upstream determinants of health and sustainability. And so we wanted to do a comprehensive policy assessment, and we wanted to know one question: are there policies in place to deliver these healthy cities? And we wanted, is it best practice policy? Is it consistent with the evidence on planning healthy cities? Is there clear and specific actions, and is it measurable with budgeted policy targets? And so what we did was we worked with all the collaborators in each of the cities to help to collect these data. And the sorts of indicators we measured were aligned with the first series, 2016 series. We looked at whether there was integrated planning across all the different government departments that create cities. Are there policies to encourage and support integrated planning? Air pollution policy, destination accessibility, do people have access to public transport, basically? Are there policies around the distribution of employment across the whole city rather than just in the inner city? Is there demand management for controlling the amount of parking that's available that restricts where cars can drive? Are there policies around the design of the street networks, the density of housing, distance to transit, and what was the investments in transport infrastructure, particularly active transport infrastructure as opposed to roads? So we started to look at all of these areas. So first of all, what we found was, most importantly, as you might expect, that there was a lot of variation between the cities in terms of what they had access to. So for example, in Belfast, here we have the top result there is that it had 24 of the 24 policies that we looked at. It had all of them. But here we have the overall, and on the right there, the quality of those policies. We found that only 39 of the 57 policies were high quality. And you can see the variation there. You can see that Sao Paulo, for example, had 16.5% got a score of 16.5 for its policy present, and a 30 out of 57, not that difference to Sao Paulo. But you can see Bangkok, which is also a middle income country, or lower middle income country, only has 7 policies of the policies present and only had a score of 3. So it had a very poor policy environment. We see that Sao Paulo provides a bit of a role model for other cities to produce a better outcome because it does have a better policy framework. We found important policy gaps. Some things were present, some things were not. We found that there was a lot of inconsistency with planning, the evidence around planning healthy cities, particularly around things like the levels of density that cities required, about things like promoting driving as opposed to providing active transport. So there was a lot of inconsistencies, and we found that there was definitely an absence of measurable policy standards and targets, that many cities might have a policy, but they're not aiming for anything in particular. So it's not measurable. It's sort of like a motherhood statement, and they didn't have targets that they were aiming for, which means that it's easy to say we want to have good public transport system, but where really the rubber hits the road, as people say, is when it says the policies say we want 80% of people to have access to within 400 metres of a public transport stop, and we want to achieve that by a certain date. So this is a sort of thing of a measurable policy standard and target. We also, I mentioned that the World Health Organization had launched its new strategy, and we wanted to explore what are the minimum thresholds for urban design features to achieve the World Health Organization targets to increase physical activity by 2030. And this work was led by Esther Sarin, Professor Esther Sarin, who's at Australian Catholic University, and she led a team. It was based on work that had already been undertaken. I mentioned there is this network called the IPEN network, the International Physical Activity and Environment Network. And so we were able to leverage that data. It involved 10 countries, it involved 14 cities, it involved adults, focused on walking. It was the right sort of study to actually answer this question. And so we were able to leverage this data to answer this important question. And why it was so important is it showed that there were definitely thresholds that we had to get to if we wanted to. In this case, she looked at, there was a number of different thresholds she looked at, but she wanted to look at what are the urban design measures that would increase the probability of people achieving 150 minutes of total walking per week. And she found that for density, this is population density per square kilometre, and what she found was that we needed to get up to densities of at least around 6,491 people per kilometre. Now, in the Australian context, that's around, well, we work in hectares in Australia, it's around 25 to 26 dwellings per hectare, which is exactly what we had found in our own studies in Australia of what's needed. But we were currently building around 14 dwellings per hectare out on the fringe of our city. If you want to have a sense of what 25 to 26 dwellings per hectare, it's sort of a little bit lower density than Fitzroy. Fitzroy is around 35 dwellings per hectare. So it's not, we're not talking high density here by global standards. We're talking pretty modest density. And so we can see here, that's the lower threshold, but we also saw that there was a threshold for intersection density. Intersections density affects the connectivity of the street networks and either makes it easy for people to walk or difficult. And so we found that there was also a threshold, and that is important because that affects the size of the blocks in a neighbourhood. It affects, whether you've got cul-de-sacs or a grid pattern network. That's all important. So this said we needed to get to about 122 intersections per kilometre. But we also, in this work, was important, although we're inconclusive because there weren't enough high density, very high density cities in the study. There seemed to be an upper threshold for density, beyond which you started to see a decrease in the amount of physical activity that people were doing. And the same applied for street connectivity. So it's not all this more density is good and just keep on building density. There may be a sweet spot to encourage people to be physically active, to have more active and sustainable lifestyles. There may be a sweet spot that we needed to consider. Now, the next thing we wanted to look at was, what's the spatial distribution of these health supportive environments in cities, and do urban dwellings have equal access to health supportive environments in cities? And this work was led by Jeff Boeing with Jonathan Arundel and my team and Carl Higgs. Jeff is at the University of Southern California, and he led this team and the team worked together. Now, we wanted to do this in a very different way to the way we would traditionally do our geospatial work. We wanted to source data that would allow us to validate against local data, but in particular, we wanted to access the open data community, to use open data, because this is something that would allow us to work more internationally. If we could prove that it's possible to use open data, that it's a valid source of data compared to data collected by governments, this would allow us to upscale the work to be even more, a bigger study. So we also, the other thing that they wanted to do, the team, they wanted to use an open source framework that would allow, software framework that would allow other people to use the tools that we create to replicate what we've done, either to repeat in the city, the 25 cities that we've been already working in, or to upscale that globally to more cities. So there was a couple of ways that we wanted to work with this particular paper, and then we wanted to create these indicators of urban and design. Now these are very small maps, and I don't expect that you'll be able to see them in detail, but I just wanted to point a couple of things out to you. First of all, the legend. So what we see here is if the pink means that these are maps of how walkable the neighbourhoods are, and the walkability is created by the density of the street connectivity and access to daily living destinations, and it's created into a Z-score, and then we can map it to compare cities. Now anything that's pink is good. So that's really what I want you to focus. Anything that is dark blue is not so good. They would be the low walkable neighbourhoods and people would be expected to drive. Now there's a couple of things about these maps which are important. First of all, if we have a look down here at the bottom, these are all the European cities. And what you can see, there's a lot of pink in these maps, and that's not surprising. They are the more traditionally designed, walkable neighbourhoods. They were designed for walking, and most of them, and you can see the great potential for people to walk in these cities. Not in every city, but you can see compared to the other cities where there's less green, that these are walkable neighbourhoods. What's really important, I think, for Australia is that we see quite the opposite pattern in Australian cities. These are the Australian cities. You can only see in very small amount of pink. That's because most of our cities are not walkable. They are designed for driving, and it's a similar pattern that we see for the US cities that are up here. Very little green, a little bit in Baltimore, but in most of the other cities, some in Phoenix, which is the one in the middle, there's no green, hardly any pink at all. Mostly it's green. What you'd expect. We've created cities for car-dependent cities in the Australian and the US context. Now, we also looked at, I mentioned about these population thresholds that Esther had worked on, and we wanted to look at, well, given that high income country density is so important, not because of density itself, but where you've got density, you're more likely to have more shops and services, and that's the shops and services that people use to be able to have active and sustainable lifestyles. And I mentioned earlier that one of the big problems is that the high-income countries are generating most of the greenhouse gas emissions, but the low-income countries and the middle-income countries are most at risk. And what's interesting about this is what we see here in terms of the levels of density that are meeting the WHO's target to decrease by 15% insufficient, or increase by 15% insufficient physical activity. We see that in middle-income countries, 97% of people live in neighbourhoods where the densities are sufficient. Whereas in high-income countries, only 37% of people live in neighbourhoods where they have enough density to decrease in physical inactivity or increase physical inactivity. So what we're saying here is that one of the big problems is that high-income countries, which are the great emitters of greenhouse gas emissions, are being built in a way that the densities are so low that it doesn't encourage people to be physically active by walking. What they do is they encourage people to drive, as we saw in those maps. But this is just another way of putting it, and was important from WHO's perspective, because they do have these targets that they want the world to achieve by 2030. So in terms of our empirical findings for the study, we found that it was feasible to measure city planning policies, that urban policies in the cities where we've studied, they lack measurable targets and standards. And this is important because we've identified that there definitely are thresholds for urban design features that would encourage active and sustainable lifestyles. Most cities are not got anywhere near those sorts of levels of targets. We found it was feasible to create spatial indicators of health supportive environment, but we also found that there was substantial inequities in our cities, both within cities and between cities. But we wanted to go one step further with the series, and we wanted to pave the way for another series and to put on the agenda some of the big issues that are around in the 21st century that need to be really addressed urgently in cities, as we've seen with the IPC reports. And we wanted to look at this a little bit more seriously. So we asked the question, what next? Well, we looked back and thought, well, what's happened since we published in 2016? And we found that the evidence has grown grown, and it's also grown stronger. So there's many more longitudinal studies now, which from a public health point of view or a health point of view are the stronger study designs. So we're finding that before there used to be a lot of cross-sectional data, now there's a lot of longitudinal data. The evidence is still the same story, that we can create healthy and sustainable communities and they would promote health. The evidence is stronger about that. But what's very alarming is that we also identified that air pollution and highlighted that air pollution is the 4th largest risk factor for global mortality. But we continue to, you can see this little image on the right of the way we're building our cities. We still create car-centric cities, and many people are living in cities where the air quality is hazardous by WHO standards, which is really harming people's health. Now, this is important from many points of view, for children, for older adults, for general population. In Australia, more people die from air pollution than double the number of people die from air pollution than die on the roads, and yet we have a big focus on reducing traffic fatalities, of course, but air quality is actually another driver of ill health, respiratory diseases, cardiovascular diseases. And we also have an ageing population, and air pollution is also related to cognitive health. And this is a growing, as we have an ageing population, is an emerging priority issue. We found that many of the features, the urban design and transport features that we've studied in our series, are linked to dementia risk factors, and this is a growing problem in our cities. But of course, the urgency for integrated city planning has become palpable now. We know that cities generate, are the major generators of emissions, but they're also being directly affected by emissions. So we need to have integrated city planning that will mitigate and adapt to climate change. And this is becoming more and more urgent. Now, the other thing that's happened, of course, in recent years, and that's what we wanted to emphasise, is, of course, COVID. And that has highlighted just how vulnerable we are in cities. What the evidence is telling us, it's not density as such that's the problem, but certainly people who live in crowded housing or in crowded conditions, they were much more vulnerable during the pandemic. Even if they're living on the fringe, if the houses are crowded, that was a bigger risk factor than density by itself. Where people lived in housing that has poor air circulation, and even alarmingly, ambient air pollution, where people lived in environments where the ambient air pollution is high, they are more at risk because the COVID could sit on the polluted air, on the particles, and so it becomes very important to mitigate, to reduce air pollution from that point of view as well. The other alarming thing, I think, what we've seen during the pandemic is this migration to the suburbs and regions, the potential to, throw out the baby with the bathwater, as they say, around density. But density is really important because it will reduce the need to drive because there's shops and services nearby, but people have migrated to the suburbs, and it's yet to be seen about what will happen in the future. They've also migrated to the regions, and that's putting pressure on infrastructure and house prices. We've seen, people being displaced, lower income households, because people from the inner city who can now work from home or from cities are now living in regional cities. We also found during the pandemic that if you lived in amenity-rich areas, you probably did better because you had access to all the things that you needed for daily living nearby. But of course, what we showed, you can see those walkability maps, is there's definitely inequitable access to amenity-rich areas where there's shops, services, and all the things that people need for daily living. We also saw some positive things. We saw during the pandemic a rapid transformations, telecommuting, which we think is health supportive, road being a space being reallocated to walking, cycling and commerce and recreation. We saw pop-up cycle lanes being a proliferation of them throughout the world of pop-up cycle infrastructure, which has been fantastic. And we also, I thought, which was a fantastic commitment, the C40. C40 is the global network of mayors, particularly of the mayors of the megacities, and they have made a commitment to build back better, we need to build better cities, and a real commitment to building 15-minute cities that would promote health, that would be much more sustainable, that would reduce emissions, and it would be more equitable, that people would have access to creating a city of villages, which is really very aligned with what is happening in Melbourne. Melbourne's got to focus on the 20-minute neighbourhood, the same sort of idea, just a smaller buffer. But the question, I think, what we asked ourselves is, we think it's really important that we do move to 15-minute cities, 20-minute neighbourhoods, but how do we optimise the compact city? That we can get this awfully wrong. We need to be thinking about how to optimise it to produce better results for our cities that will protect human health, ecosystem health, and planetary health. And as a result of that, we proposed a new framework, not a new framework, a modified framework, a much more complex framework, more factors that need to be considered if we want to both promote active transportation at the expense of driving and public transport, and we promote public transport and active transportation at the expense of driving, but at the same time protect people from these other bigger impacts and protect human health, ecosystem health, and planetary health. We needed to have a broader framework and to re-emphasize things. Now, I don't have time to talk you through the whole thing, but I do want to just point out a few of the additional pathways that we've added into this. First of all, you might remember that in the first series we proposed that we needed to have 8 integrated urban systems that work together to create the 8 urban and transport planning design interventions. But in our new framework, what we've proposed is that we actually need 11, and we've added in some additional policy areas that need to be considered, and that would create 11, the 11 Ds. We added in, so we've got the 3 regional interventions: destination accessibility, distribution of employment, demand management, but we've added in disaster mitigation. We can't ignore that with climate change. And then we've considered not only 5 local urban design features, but now we've added in 7. So we've got the design of the street networks, the density of the housing, destination proximity, which we found was so important during the pandemic, that things are proximate, distance to transit, the diversity of destinations, but also the diversity of housing, how desirable it is, how safe it is, but also how green, but also distributed. That what we found is that we have many inequities in our cities that has definitely been shown up in during COVID, and so we needed to distribute these interventions across cities. Now, why is this important? Well, I just want to point out a couple of the pathways. First of all, I mentioned that one of the biggest issues around with urbanisation is the impacts on biodiversity, which is really affecting our ecosystems. And there's been enormous biodiversity loss in recent decades because of urbanisation, which is affecting a whole range of things, but in particular, in this case, a range of infectious diseases. What we're proposing is that we needed to have nature-based solutions to help tackle this, that cities need to have policies that will protect nature and propose nature-based solutions. Not only would that make our cities more desirable, it would increase access to urban greening, but it would also prevent biodiversity loss, and it would reduce energy loss because greener environments would be cooler, which is very important given the heat island effects that we're all experiencing, where there isn't enough greenery, which is important because that would reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which are related to climate change, and climate change has a whole range of impacts on the health and well-being of residents of cities. So that's one example of one of the pathways. We also added in that we could be using nature-based solutions for disaster mitigation with flooding, using nature-based solutions to mitigate against flood. With air pollution, which is obviously a major factor that needs to be considered in our cities through all the driving that we do in particular. This is important because it affects greenhouse emissions, and it also affects then downstream in terms of health, affects respiratory diseases, heat stress, and also major chronic diseases. But if we're serious about addressing air pollution, we need comprehensive air quality policies which really tackle some of the big issues. That includes the way we're building our cities to reduce the need for driving and the ability to drive, focusing more on walking, cycling, public transport use. And that's important because, of course, it's the cars that create the traffic, that generate the pollution, that create traffic congestion, all of which affect health. So you can see this is the sort of thinking that we've put into the series, and when there's other pathways which are argued in the paper. Now, we've also argued that if this is going to be achieved, it'll only be achieved if we have good and integrated governance, and in particular, government departments working across vertically between different levels of government, but horizontally across the different levels of government to achieve the best outcomes. And a big focus is that we added in distributed, that we needed to be focusing on equity. This was a really critical factor in our cities, that it wasn't fair that we were producing cities that were so inequitable, as shown up during COVID, that some people were able to live quite well during COVID and others were not. Now, our series has emphasised a call to action, so we've included in here what's needed for global agencies, for national, regional, and local governments, for policymakers and practitioners. We've talked about the need to benchmark and monitor progress in cities, and at the moment we're talking to WHO, the World Health Organization, about the potential for them to use some of our indicators to create this global system of indicators. We want people to use and expand the tools that we've created, so we've created tools that people can use. They're all open source. I mentioned that we need to transform urban governance, horizontal integration across government departments, but also vertical integration between different government departments. And we need to strengthen our policy environments. Governments need to be using evidence to support better cities, planning policies, but they also need to monitor implementation. Even if you've got a policy, what we've shown very clearly in Australia is that people have policies, but they're not being fully implemented. And as a result of that, we're producing terrible outcomes. And for high-income countries, we really do need to support low and middle-income countries and disadvantaged communities who are going to be the ones who are most at risk with climate change. We've had our call to action also included civil society, citizens, and the research community. And you can have a look through the series. There's a range of calls to action, but most of all, we argued that we needed to be creating and using open source data. We found that it was as valid or more valid than routinely collected data from government, mainly because it's probably collected more frequently. So we need to encourage citizen science programs, and government could do that. But we want citizens to get involved in this. We, as academics, if we want evidence informed policy, we need to create policy and practice relevant evidence. That's really critical. And that can only really be achieved if you're co-designing with policymakers and practitioners. So it's a call to action to academics to work in a closer way with policymakers and practitioners. And for funders, it's very hard to do a study like this. We actually did it on the smell of an oily rag. We didn't have new funding. Everyone just jumped on board, got excited about what we were doing, and we all did it within the funding that we had. We didn't have new funding. But we've shown, I think, the importance of this type of work, and we believe that research funders should prioritise, or at least seriously look at multi-sector, multi-outcome, multi-country studies. And that also goes for the reviewers. Many of you might be on the line today. People who review grants need to see that these sorts of studies are really important and worth funding. But most of all, we wanted cities to use evidence to inform policy and to also to benchmark and monitor implementation. And so to this end, Carl Higgs, who's a data scientist, public health PhD student or candidate in our group, did some incredible work where he automated the development of report cards for the cities. He did 46 report cards in the 25 cities because he translated them into 16 different languages, which were all checked by our local collaborators. And the reports benchmark and monitor cities against each other, so they get their own report and they can see how they fit compared to other cities. This is the one for Almanok in the Czech Republic. We've got indicators there telling them how they compare in terms of the availability and the quality of their policies. This is obviously the one for Hong Kong. And then we've also have maps in our report cards that show, in this case, it's the walkability relative to the other 25 cities that are in the study. So you can see, and these have been launched in local launches through our collaborators in the 25 cities. So we've already done, I think, about 10 different launches, and there's more on the agenda to come in the future. We launched in May. And we also have launched an observatory. So we have a global observatory of healthy and sustainable cities where we've got the report cards. This was led by Deb Salvo at Washington University. She's led that work, and we've got a website. It's got the scorecards. It's got a launch of our series, but it also invites people to join the 1,000 City Challenge. We want to make this upscale our work and go to the 1,000 City Challenge. This is getting ready for our 3rd series. So that's really the work that we've been doing on for about the last 3 or 4 years now. I want to acknowledge the enormous team that's been involved in this. You know, you don't do a study like this without enormous collaboration, and so this is one lot of the collaborators. This is the rest of the team. So it's been an enormous team effort across the world. And I also want to thank our funders. We've had funding both from RMIT, but also from for our team, but also from our group, the Australian Prevention Partnership Centre, which has supported our team, that's contributed to this study. And I'm going to stop there and thank you for listening. If you're interested, the series can be available here. That's the first link where the series is available. And if you want to have a look at the website, that's where the website is. So thank you. I'll come back now.
Thank you very much, Billie, for the fascinating talk. Anybody, if you have any questions, please send to the Q&A, and I will ask Billie. There's a couple of questions coming in already. So before we touch on those, I just take the privilege as a chair to ask first a few questions. So you mentioned, I can see that one of the slides you mentioned, you measure the degree of policies by the number of policy developed in country, for example, in Thailand. But have you looked at, the depth? They may have one report, but they cover much more broader aspects than just another. I mean, is that any sort of measurement of those kind of in terms of the extent of the area they covered, the depths that they covered,
Yeah, so what we did was we looked at a whole range of policies. So we looked at urban planning policies, we looked at transport policies, we looked at urban greening policies. So it wasn't just one policy document that we looked at. Through our local collaborators, we went through and we tried to find the policies because they might be in different areas. So we did a comprehensive search of the policy environment in those cities to find out whether they were available. And actually what's really telling, I didn't have time to show you, but if you compare, I mentioned about Sao Paulo compared to Bangkok. Sao Paulo had a reasonable, compared to other cities, but a better policy environment actually than Australia. But if you looked at the policy environment in Sao Paulo compared to Bangkok, the policy environment was better in Sao Paulo than Bangkok, and the outcomes on the ground were better as well. So you look at the outcomes on the ground through the spatial indicators, and you can see that there's a lot of people have poor access to lots of things in Bangkok, and they're both sort of middle income countries. So it's not like they're the high income countries. So I think what's great about this is it shows that it's possible, if you've got a better policy environment, to produce better outcomes on the ground for the people who live there. So that's a good result. And what we would encourage, and that we were hoping through, and what we've said through the World Health Organization, all these global agencies, is to help countries to improve their policy environments, to show them what's possible, and then to work with them to produce a better outcome in those cities. So I think the high income countries have a responsibility there, but also these multilateral agencies have a big responsibility too. And what we've shown is what happens when you've got poor policy and what the outcomes on the ground and what's the potential to produce a better outcome.
Okay, thanks. So we got a question here. So will there be a time when Melbourne's urban growth boundary will be fixed, not continue to be pushed out, expanded, and overridden?
That's actually completely true. I mean, we have a big problem. I mean, what's alarming actually, when you look at the Australian cities, we do really badly. Like if you take a global perspective, we are not doing well, and just continuing to push out on the fringe of our cities is really damaging on many fronts. I'm encouraged to say, and I've been involved with the Victorian Planning Authority. They've been putting together guidelines for the new developments, and there is a big focus now on trying to increase densities, but it's not density for density's sake. It's density so you can get amenity. And so, because where you've got enough density, and I'm not talking high density, 25 dwellings per hectare, I think they're pushing for 20 dwellings per hectare, which is a lot more than they've got now. It's not enough in my opinion, but nevertheless, it's better than it was. It means that you can have a better public transport, you can deliver public transport services, and it means that you've got enough people so that shops can be nearby. And that's really the critical thing. People don't walk because of the density, they walk because there's somewhere to walk to, and they can have better public transport so they can get out of their cars. I think COVID and the working from home has really highlighted just how important local neighbourhoods are. People have come to value their local neighbourhoods because many white collar workers at least can work from home now. But okay, I agree with you that the urban growth boundary, we really do need to make that fixed and just say we're just not going to build our cities at the size of our cities. And those maps are a little bit misleading because if you look at the legends, they are all of different size. Our cities are ridiculously large by global standards.
So here's the question relating to COVID from Lee Parker. So given the ongoing duration of COVID and its already evident long-term hybrid and decentralized office working impact on city offices, what is your ongoing research agenda for examining this impact?
Well, the impacts of people working from home. I haven't got a research agenda around that at all. I haven't put any more new grants in on this, but we're upscaling to go global with the 1,000 City Challenge, so I'm a bit distracted with that. But I do think that there is, as we see that more people are working from home and want it to continue so, I think that is an important research agenda to see that what will be the long-term impacts of this, and also the long-term impacts in our regional cities, because we've just published a paper, or just about to publish a paper on this, where we've shown that, very interestingly, that in the larger capital cities, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, people who are most disadvantaged live in the least livable neighbourhoods, the ones where there's less amenity, and that means they have to drive, which doesn't make it affordable living because they have to drive so much, they have to run 2 or 3 cars. In the smaller capital cities and in the regional cities, it's actually the opposite, that the more disadvantaged areas are in the most livable areas. That's because they're, like if you imagine in a regional city, they live in the inner city, where probably people who are wealthier might want to go and buy a property on the fringe. We need to ensure that that continues. What concerns me about COVID is that, in regional cities at least, is that people have moved to the regions and displaced those people who may be renting the inner city properties. The property prices have really escalated, and that means those people are displaced. I don't know where they're going to go. So what we've argued is that we need policies to reduce the risk of the suburbanisation of disadvantage in those smaller capital cities and the regional cities. And you do that through inclusionary zoning. There's lots of things that you can do, but there needs to be policies that avoid people getting kicked out of where the amenity is, because it is health promoting, and the people who are most at risk are the people who are the least advantaged. So yeah, it's a complicated story. But I don't have a research agenda around COVID, but it is an important area to pursue.
Okay, here's the question, seems to coming from a student. is the urban design planning related to the specific policies of Melbourne government departments? For example, if I want to make an urban design and a development plan for Melbourne, what should I consider?
Well, you should have a look at the Victorian Planning Authority. So there's different ways to think about the city. So there's the established areas and then there's the new areas. Though the Victorian Planning Authority now has precinct structure plan review, precinct structure plan guidelines about what it's trying to achieve with at the outer suburban areas and the new areas. And so you should look at those to look at what are the guidelines. So they've tried to make them a bit more, prescriptive, that put these measurable standards in, and as a result of that, hopefully produce a better result over time. So that would be one way that you could look in the established areas. The 20-minute neighbourhood concept, that's another thing to look at, and that also includes, guidelines. How far should people live from shops and services? 800 metres is what they've said, and which is based on our research actually, which is exciting. So that's another sort of a document that you should look at, because that's trying to change the existing activity centres as a way of achieving a city of villages. That's quite challenging because, and I think cycling, the 20-minute neighbourhood focuses on walking. I think they need to incorporate cycling, because in the established areas, the activity centres are not close enough. They are, they're further apart. We worked out on average, people in Melbourne up until a few years ago, they had to walk 1.4 kilometres to get to a supermarket. Now that means that, you're not going to get a walkable environment in that case if the activity centres have supermarkets. So I would look at the 20-minute neighbourhood both in established areas and for the new areas, and the precinct structure plans guidelines for guidance about what urban design requirements are.
Okay, so we're just about a couple of minutes to the end. So I'm just curious. I have one question. I mean, the work you have done is, I think it's around the 2016, right? I mean, work done. But from since then, if you look at geopolitical situation, this is just a completely different world. But how do you see the long term? I mean, in terms of, because you actually rely on this global access, to different countries to compare, but that situation is quite a very worrying. How do you see your future work?
So our work is not. We published the first Lancet series in 2016. With the recent publications were published in 2022. So this is recent work. I'm really encouraged by the C40, the mayors of megacities. We see it in Paris, we see it all over the world. The World Economic Forum are all talking about the 15-minute city. Okay. I think people have recognised, I mean, there's climate change, there's equity issues, and it's not fair that we build our cities that think that everyone that lives on the fringe has an affordable housing with no amenity. That to me is completely unfair. We need to think differently about the way we build cities, and I think that there's an appetite to do things differently. I'm encouraged. The danger is that people think the pathway to get there is just density, but it's not density. I call it delightful livable density, because it's not density for density's sake, it's density with amenity. And that's the really critical thing. If we build density without amenity, it's just high-rise sprawl. So it's really the density with amenity so that people can get out of their cars. People are going to want to live in their neighbourhoods more. If the same trends continue post-COVID, people are going to want to work from home more. That means they want to go out for a coffee. They want to have local, access to collaborative working spaces and things like that. So yeah, I think I'm feeling optimistic. Yeah, call me an optimist. I don't mind.
Yeah. Well, time is really about, but we got a question coming. So this is a quick one. So regional city like Adelaide are really benefiting from an influx of Melbourne, Sydney COVID migrants. Does your research suggest any major benefits or challenges of this trend?
I think that is a major benefit. I think it's a tragedy that we don't have more people distributed throughout Australia, throughout the cities. Canberra, Adelaide, as it was mentioned, all these other cities, the smaller capital cities, they could have more people. Melbourne and Sydney are going to trend. I mean, they're on trend, or they were, to become mega cities. more than 10 million people by 2050. Both Melbourne and Sydney were on trend, or just after 2056. I know we'll probably be a bit delayed now because of reduction in immigration, but that will change because we have to have immigration. So we'll go back to having immigration if we could distribute those people across our cities and not perpetuate sprawl. Like, for example, Perth is 170 kilometres long. That is dreadful. They've got 2.5 million people, 170 kilometres long. That's really wrong. We should not be building cities like that. In the 21st century, we need to protect human health, ecosystem health, planetary health, and that is not the way to do it. So to me, it's great that people are going to other cities. We just need to make them as cool as Melbourne, because Melbourne's a great city. But we also need to make sure that those cities are sustainable and do it in a way that's going to produce a good result for our country.
Thank you very much, Billie. We're just about arriving at the time, even so we have one more question. Thank you so much. Thank you everyone for attending. We'll see you next time. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah.